Let's be brutally honest right now. That's a big question.
I'm looking for someone who doesn't want to go to base camp, but they want to go to the very top.
Whether it's here, India, New York.
Civilization was born at happy hour.
That's what wins. That's what stands out. That's what people are interested in. That's what I want to know. The Hospopreneurs Podcast with James Henderson. Hello and welcome to episode 106 of the Hospopreneurs Podcast. Michael Fox, co-founder of the plant-based meat company Fable Food Co, joins me on the program today. The interview was recorded in the depths of the coronavirus during April, just 12 months after the collapse of Michael's previous venture, a fashion startup called Shoes of Prey. Michael tells us more about this during the interview. Since launching on the menu at dinner by Heston, things have continued to look positive, with Blackbird Ventures and Grok Ventures both having backed the business. They've got deals with Woolworths, Marley Spoon and more, so if you haven't heard of Fable yet, you will soon. Hello, Michael. Thank you very much for joining me today on the program. As you know, the first question that I ask on this show is a crazy hospitality story. Do you have a crazy hospitality story, Michael?
So just before the coronavirus shutdowns, my co-founders and I were very fortunate to spend a couple of days with Heston Blumenthal and his team in the south of France doing some product development work. And then he had us to the Fat Duck for lunch in late February, one of the world's best restaurants. That made it just an unbelievable experience. And then he and his team had done a whole bunch of different things to kind of tailor the dining experience. And I imagine they do this for a lot of guests, but they'd put our Fable logo on some of the items that you get over the lunch. For one of the menu items, it was this sort of section of the lunch. It was about an hour of eating all these things from the forest. And this table setting comes out. Everyone's sort of got this forest table setting in the restaurant in the middle of their table. And ours they'd specifically made these little mushrooms in the table setting because our Fable product, which I'm sure we'll get onto, is based on mushrooms. And so, no one else in the restaurant had these little mushrooms in their table setting, but they'd done that for ours. And there were just a bunch of other fun little personalization things that they'd done like that. And like incredible food, incredible experience. A tour of the kitchen afterwards, just amazing to see how they operate. Yeah, fantastic experience.
What an experience. Thank you for sharing that. Had you been to dinner in Melbourne? Had you been to dinner by Heston?
Yeah. Actually, we did our launch event at Dinner by Heston in Melbourne.
How did you find the difference as well?
I think it's just the Fat Duck is just kind of a level up. I mean, it's 3 Michelin stars. I'd say that food was on par at both, but it was the whole experience, whole dining experience at the Fat Duck was just a level up. Like we were there for 5.5 hour lunch. Yeah.
A lot more theatrical, I guess.
Exactly. That's it. Just that experience in the theatre of eating.
Excellent. The next question that I normally get into then is why you do what you do, Michael.
Yeah, so I've been vegetarian for 4.5 years, and for me that just started out as a personal thing. For me, kind of the order of reasons for having gone vegetarian is ethical, environmental and health. And I had a fashion business for 10 years. I finished up with that about 18 months ago, and I sort of took 6 months off and was thinking through what I wanted to do next, and just got very passionate about the idea of, for all the same reasons I'm vegetarian, wanting to contribute to helping minimize our use of industrial animal agriculture. And so was thinking through the ways that I could contribute to that. Having been vegetarian, I've talked to family and friends around me about why I'm vegetarian and tried to convince some of those people to turn vegetarian. I think I've convinced 2 people in 4.5 years. I caught up with one of them recently and he's not even vegetarian anymore. So I'm obviously a pretty bad activist. Figured, well, maybe I can take my entrepreneurial skills. And, I've been living in Los Angeles the last 4 years and eating all the Impossible and Beyond burgers and enjoying those. And so thought, well, maybe I can apply my entrepreneurial skills and find another gap in the market for a different sort of meat alternative product, and maybe can help some of those people who want to reduce their meat consumption but still love the taste of meat, have a product that helps them to be able to eat less meat coming from animals.
There are a couple of things in your answer there that I'd love to open up a bit more, but did you have any experience with alternative meats or in food production before you started Fable?
No. So, I'd done a fashion business for the last decade called Shoes of Prey. Kind of design your own women's shoes online, sort of fashion technology business. And it's sort of ridden the startup roller coaster up and unfortunately for that business, ultimately down. And so I had lots of business, entrepreneurial, brand building experience and manufacturing experience in shoes, but no particular experience in meat alternatives other than having eaten a lot of them for 3 years. And no particular experience in food other than enjoy cooking at home, shop at my local farmers markets and that sort of thing, but nothing professionally.
Yeah, and I do have some questions for your fashion business. That's something I want to address soon. But, obviously entering the food industry without that background, how did you cope with that? You had to find someone who did have that experience or learn quickly. So what did you do?
Both. Learn quickly and involve other people who could plug my skill set gaps. So I had this idea that I wanted to do a meat alternative. I wanted to replicate a different type of meat to minced beef, which is what most of the meat alternative companies are doing, kind of doing minced beef or burgers. So I wanted to do a different type of meat so that my product would be complementary rather than competitive. And then I also wanted to do a product that was kind of whole food based, minimally processed and all natural ingredients. Just kind of going back to my own personal philosophies of eating, shopping at my local farmers markets, doing a lot of my own cooking, wanted a meat alternative that would fit in with that. And so, just had that thought and obviously no food background. So went out and talked to anyone in the food industry who would talk to me and answer my questions. And so that was everyone from chefs, restaurant owners, food scientists, and then ultimately two guys that became my co-founders who are in the mushroom industry. Talked to food manufacturers. So just trying to learn as much as I could and then also searching for people who I could partner with who had the skill sets that I lacked.
Do you find any resources in that really gave you, that 80-20? Like you've done 20%, you get 80% of the payoff. Was there anything that was just gave you this huge payoff from putting minimal effort into absorbing some sort of like a tool or a key piece of knowledge or group or community? Or was there something that you learned in that process that just accelerated your knowledge?
No particular resource, but there were a few key people along the way that like an hour conversation with someone and they might have introduced me to 3 or 4 other people who were then particularly influential. There were probably a good 10 or 15 people along the way that had a really outsized impact on where I and the business have ended up.
Where were they from? Were they from the mushroom industry or food in generally? And were they specific individuals that you want to name?
Yeah, so there are a few people. Where to start? So I ended up on this Mars Seeds of Change food startup accelerator program. That program was particularly helpful, and there were a lot of people on that program who had a big impact. So Peter Crane, who's the former head of R&D at Mars, has been particularly helpful along the way and still is helpful. There were different chefs who introduced me to different people. Actually, one of our investors, Grok Ventures, the partner there that we work with, Lucy Hankin, she introduced me to my now 2 co-founders, and she introduced me to a bunch of other people in the food space because she'd been doing some investing in that area. So she was particularly helpful. Just think about the learnings from it. I don't think there's any particular way to work out how to identify those people who are going to be helpful. It was just a case of spreading the net far and wide, talking to who was happy to talk to me, and then asking questions and doing a lot of listening and trying to learn. And then people could see I was genuinely mission-driven about what I was doing. And that seemed, for a lot of people, meant that they then opened up their networks and were happy to help.
So in meeting these people, you mentioned there that you don't know who's going to be helpful, or there was no real indication into knowing who was going to be helpful. How then did you decide whose advice to take along the way?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a very good question. My experience having done Shoes of Prey, maybe that helped me to be able to identify a little bit more about which advice was helpful and which wasn't. But anything food related, early on, I really didn't know much. So it was, kind of a case of taking all their advice and then pulling the threads in all those different areas that they'd suggested that I do and just seeing where that took me. And I guess, just being conscious of trying to prioritize my time and work out, what I thought was going to be most helpful. I guess it's a combination of just experience and just trying to learn as fast as I could. And I mean, I made a whole bunch of mistakes along the way too. So I wouldn't say I'm an expert at it.
I want to elaborate on that. I mentioned I had some questions about Shoes of Prey, and you mentioned it there in the answer. I was still interested in sort of how that background has shaped the way you do business now. Things went quite well, at least in the earlier stages, building that. I understand you were funded. Can you tell us a bit about that process, how you went about that? Because there are some listeners out there who'll be raising capital for their businesses and they're interested in that process and what's involved. And without going into it too much, for those who aren't in that space, just a bit of an overview as to your experience in Shoes of Prey and how that's sort of set you up to be doing what you do now.
The basic trajectory of Shoes of Prey, the concept was you could go online and design your own women's fashion shoes, and then we made them and delivered them to you. And we did really well in the first sort of 3-4 years, just operating in this niche of women who are very passionate about customizing. But then we saw this bigger opportunity to take the product into the mass market. We basically had all these mass market customers coming to our website. They were designing shoes and they were obviously intrigued by the concept, but they just weren't buying. So we did a whole bunch of market research around these customers, and they told us that, yes, they loved the idea of designing their own shoes. They just wanted faster lead times, a lower retail price, and a more simplified shoe design experience. So to deliver that value proposition, we went out and raised capital from venture capital firms, and we invested that in, rather than outsourcing manufacturing, we built our own shoe factory in China, got very good at making shoes one at a time, and we built out our software engineering and user experience team to simplify the shoe design experience. So over sort of years 4 to 9 in the life of the business, we sort of grew to about 200 employees. We raised, across 4 rounds of funding, we raised $35 million in venture capital. We partnered with David Jones in Australia, Nordstrom in the US, and you could go into stores and design your own shoes. And we basically built out and delivered this value proposition to the mass market customer that our market research said that she wanted. And we grew over that period. We probably got to about a 12 million revenue run rate, but we didn't grow enough. We needed to be at sort of 30 million revenue run rate to be at break even. And if our market research had been right, we should have been at like 100 million revenue. So now we'd built the value proposition, we could go and see what consumers were doing. And what we could see was consciously that mass market customer thought she wanted to customize. She loved the idea of it, but deep down subconsciously, she actually didn't. She really just wanted to be shown what's popular on Instagram and in fashion magazines and buy that exact shoe, which is kind of the opposite of customizing. So basically, we got our market research wrong. What the customer consciously wanted was very different to actually what she deep down subconsciously wanted. So we built the value proposition for what she consciously wanted, which was wrong. So ultimately, we had to close the business down. So that's the background. So to answer your question on applying that in Fable, a couple of big learnings focused on market research. One of the pieces that we've sort of focused on with Fable is not doing something completely new and not trying to change consumer behavior. So I guess the kind of equivalent would be in changing consumer behavior to try and get people to be vegetarian would be what I tried to do, convincing the people around me to turn vegetarian and trying to convince them to eat falafel balls and hemp seed patties, totally different food to what they normally eat. That's a hard sell. Whereas what we're trying to do with Fable is we're trying to make the product so that consumers don't have to change their behavior. So we're making a product that has the same delicious taste and texture of meat, replicates slow-cooked meats like pulled pork and braised beef, tastes almost identical. You can cook it in the same ways. It's genuinely delicious and has all the same properties of meat, but we're doing it with primarily mushrooms rather than animals. And so the consumer doesn't really have to change their behavior. They can still use the product in all the same dishes that they would normally cook with at home. They still get that same taste and texture, but they're just getting a product that is better for them, better for the environment, and more ethical.
Isn't that observation very interesting? It's a commentary on how we behave and what we say we like versus how we act. And I just think it's very interesting to hear that, because we can see all sorts of examples of that as well in other industries. I can only imagine that you'd be seeing it everywhere now after having that experience. So, which is very fascinating. To tie that into the end of your answer there, is that also why other brands are creating products that are similar to, or they're trying to replicate meat as closely as possible to make it approachable for the customer?
Yeah, exactly. Consumers have been able to eat falafel balls and hemp seed patties for years, and the fact that there's some people out there that like those foods, I do, but the fact that they're not the things that you walk into a Coles or a Woolworths and look at what's on the supermarket shelves. There might be like one SKU of falafel balls and one SKU of hemp seed patties in the vegan section, whereas you go into the meat section and it's 5 to 10% of the supermarket is straight up meat. So clearly consumers want that taste and texture of meat. They don't want to eat sort of vegetarian patties. And so delivering to customers what they want is obviously a better path than trying to convince them to eat something or buy a product that they don't actually really want.
Yes. Michael, obviously you're from a background outside of hospitality, food, and we've discussed how you've entered that industry. In doing that, I'm interested in your definition for what hospitality is about. So what do you think really defines hospitality?
Obviously, food and beverage is a core part of it, but in my mind, it's more about experience. Because I can cook my own food at home and mix my own cocktail or pour my own glass of wine at home, so I can get that same food and drink experience at home. But there's something about going out to an amazing restaurant, going out with friends, having great service at the table, and then having a dish that's different to what you might cook at home, and just the whole kind of theatrical experience of all of that. So for me, hospitality is very much sort of that experience, or providing people with that experience around eating and drinking.
Fantastic. And that seems to be the common discourse across all hospopreneurs, if I may define them as such. I'd love to know what you're learning about or exploring at the moment. So where are you pushing things forward yourself? This could be personally, professionally, however you'd like to take that question.
Yeah, that's interesting. A few different angles, but I might sort of narrow into one or two. So one is definitely like product R&D. So our kind of whole thesis behind Fable is we want to help people reduce their meat consumption, but by giving them delicious meat-like food that's made primarily from mushrooms. My two co-founders spent most of their career within the mushroom industry. So Jim's a chef and mushroom scientist. Chris is co-founder of Australia's largest organic mushroom farm and was Organic Farmer of the Year in Australia in 2018. So we've got this kind of strong technical background in mushrooms, which are obviously really healthy and delicious food. But one of the challenges is that we need to overcome is, so in Asia, people in Asia eat about 13.5 kilograms of mushrooms per person per year. In Australia, we eat about 2.3 kilos of mushrooms per person per year, and it's similar in the US. So there's a lot of people in Australia in the US that think they don't like the taste of mushrooms. And so for us, it's about taking this delicious, healthy, sustainable base and converting it into something that has the taste and texture of meat, which Australians and Americans love. And so that R&D and product development piece is an area that as a business, we're pushing really hard, and an area that I'm enjoying learning a lot about, not having been in the food industry before. So we've got our internal team, we've got some food scientists, we've got some different external chefs that we work with, as well as all of our customers, getting feedback from them. So that product development piece I'm really enjoying. The second area that we're that we're sort of pushing ourselves is, I guess, with the coronavirus situation that we find ourselves in. So for our business, our food service sales have obviously fallen off a cliff, but then the retail related parts of our business are doing well. So we sell into the meal kit business, Marley Spoon. That part of our business is doing really well. So for us, it's been challenging, but also interesting experience working out how we adapt within this environment. So an obvious piece of that is, what other products and how else can we work with Marley Spoon? What other meal kit, ready meal companies can we work with? Because their sales are obviously going well. But on the flip side, how can we work with other food service businesses, and how can we support restaurants and cafes through this period so that they exist on the other side of all this? I kind of read an article a couple of days ago saying that potentially a quarter to a third of restaurants and cafes may end up closing permanently in Australia through all of this, and that's going to be pretty horrible for this industry and also just for the consumer experience of going out and eating. I think in Australia we've got such a vibrant hospitality scene. Any of my friends from overseas who come to Australia, one of the things that they all call out is how amazing eating out in Australia is. So we've been doing some different things to kind of work through how we can support food service businesses. Just as an example, I live on the Sunshine Coast, and 2 weeks ago we ran we called it a hashtag Stay Home Date Night Hamper. And so we partnered with 4 local cafes and restaurants who had started to do takeaway and delivery. And so they did some ready meals with Fable, partnered with a local brewery who put some beers in the hamper, local vegan cake shop did some cupcakes, and then a local pottery studio did an at-home pottery kit. So come to the Fable website. We just did it as a 48-hour pop-up. You could come to the Fable website, pay $99 for this stay-at-home date night hamper that had your dinner, beer, dessert, and pottery activity. Our goal there was to sort of help spread the word for these businesses that were in our local area that were otherwise struggling. We got Channel 7 News on the Sunshine Coast, covered the hamper, got front page of the local paper, some good radio coverage, and we sold a whole bunch of the hampers, and helped get the word out about some of the other businesses. So we're looking at other scaled up versions of that we can do across other cities. So we've got a few other ideas that are in the works now. So it's kind of how we can adapt in this environment and support the other businesses that we work with. That's been a big focus.
And because we're recording this episode in April 2020, so this could come out in a while yet for listeners out there. We're back in April 2020. It's interesting there, looking at that in as much of a positive light as possible, trying to find the silver lining. What sort of opportunities do you see might be available in the future of the hospitality industry, or at least your segment within food in the hospitality industry?
In the meat alternative space, after the experience with Shoes of Prey, I've spent a lot of time doing market research. I mean, we did with Shoes of Prey too, but the good thing about this category is there are meat alternative products out there. So, I can go and stand in Coles or Woolworths and watch our customers shop the meat alternative section and then go and talk to them after they've made a purchasing decision or otherwise. I can go into restaurants and talk to the wait staff about what dishes people are ordering and what their feedback is on it. So in doing all of that market research, as well as just some general surveys that have been done on the Australian population, there's clearly a big shift in consumer sentiment to wanting to reduce meat consumption. There's a bunch of surveys that say anywhere between 30 and 50% of the Australian population actively want to reduce their animal meat consumption. And these are people who aren't vegetarian or vegan. So there's another sort of 11% of Australians who are vegetarian and vegan, and then another 30 to 50% who want to reduce their meat consumption but still love the taste and texture of meat. And it's things like there's lots of documentaries out there on all the bunch of reasons why you would want to do it, but health seems to be the primary reason people want to reduce their meat consumption, followed by climate change and the environment, and then some people doing it for ethical reasons as well. And so, this is a big swing in consumer sentiment, and it's opening up opportunities for meat alternative products. These are people who still love the taste and texture of meat but want to reduce their meat consumption. So if you can give them a product that meets those needs, they're going to want to buy that and eat that. And so, what we've seen in the last, I think, particularly last 12 months in Australia is consumers coming into restaurants and wanting more plant-based dishes on the menu, people going into supermarkets and wanting more plant-based products there. And so, chefs and restaurateurs are seeing that demand and being entrepreneurial themselves, looking for ways to meet and satisfy that demand. And a good way to do that is through meat alternatives. So I think that trend is only going to continue. And I think a sub-trend within that space, because health is the primary reason that people want to reduce their meat consumption, people particularly want healthy, whole food based, no artificial ingredient meat alternatives. And that's sort of what we set out to create and what we're leveraging the power of mushrooms to be able to create. So I'm excited by what the next few years holds for the category and holds for Fable.
On the future of food, and we talk about mushrooms a lot. The word mushroom has been said more times in this episode than any other for sure. And you do stacks of research. Do you see a future for magic mushrooms and LSD or any of those sorts of other products being used as a supplement long term? Or are you mainly focused on, obviously, the shorter term around where mushrooms are being used at the moment?
The whole mushroom space is just fascinating and I think is on the cusp of a massive boom. The meat alternative space category is growing quickly. I think the mushroom space is going to, in 10 years' time, be much larger than where it is today for a whole bunch of different reasons, not just for meat alternatives, but in some of the other areas that you allude to. There's a whole plethora of scientific research and data that shows that there is, really good potential for psilocybin or magic mushrooms to help in areas of mental health. So, helping get people over addiction, helping people with depression. And that research had sort of been shut down from the 1960s through until very recently. But now you've got a lot of universities in the US and now some in Australia starting to reopen that research. And more research needs to be done on the category. I'm not advocating we all go out and take magic mushrooms tomorrow, but there's clearly some really good potential and good signs. And so with more research, I think there'll be a lot of exciting things happening in that space, as well as like mushrooms as a nutraceutical ingredient. There's tens of thousands of different species of mushrooms. Some have amazing health benefits. Mushrooms like cordyceps, which are a species of mushroom that invades the brain of insects, controls the insects, and then ultimately consumes the insect. There's some species of cordyceps that have, for thousands of years in Chinese medicine, have been held in really high regard for having all these amazing health properties. And Western science is now starting to catch up on some of that and do research in those areas and potentially, big health benefits for humans in those mushrooms. And it kind of all stems from we evolved as humans. We would walk on a track through the forest. We ate a lot of mushrooms as we evolved. We go and pick mushrooms that were growing at the side of those paths and eat them. And so we've evolved to eat a lot more mushrooms than we do in the West today. And so, yeah, I think all of that, I'm excited for what the category holds, because I think there's going to be so much more scientific research coming out about the benefits of mushrooms, and it's going to be a food and medicine that people eat a lot more of over the coming decade or two.
Michael, as an entrepreneur and creative mind, obviously you play with many different ideas, and there's things that come to you all the time. As someone who also sits in that sort of category, it makes sense. I can understand you must play with some wild shower thoughts. I can imagine, these sorts of things come to us all the time, right? How do you play with those ideas? How do you even get into a state to develop them? And then how do you play with them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've tried to stick to Shoes of Prey. When I started Shoes of Prey, there was nothing mission-driven behind starting a fashion business for me. I wasn't particularly passionate about women's shoes. There were lots of things I was passionate about with the business. I loved online retail. I could see that was a growing category. I love manufacturing, all these other parts of the business. But what I've tried to stick to this time is to start a business and develop a product that I'm deeply personally mission-driven and passionate about. And I've tried to use that as the guidepost for what I focus my time on and what I'm doing. So, I mean, even your question in the mushroom category, oh my God, there is so much potential in this category. And as you alluded to, the entrepreneur's mind goes and jumps to, should I start a magic mushroom business tomorrow? Should I start a mushroom nutraceutical business tomorrow? And even in the food space, there's lots of exciting opportunities. But I've tried to stay focused on, as I mentioned before, I'm vegetarian for ethical, environmental, and health reasons, and really passionate about helping humanity end industrial animal agriculture. And so I'm doing everything I can to keep my optimistic, excitable entrepreneurial brain focused in on that one mission and objective. Yeah, so that's keeping me on meat alternatives made from mushrooms, kind of ticks the boxes. So trying to stay focused in on that.
And that's the mission, to rein it in, to keep it on track. So how do you rein in those thoughts and pick something to go with?
Yeah, so I guess it's a couple of things. I mean, I think there's a Steve Jobs or somebody like him quote around, it's for an entrepreneur, it's not what you say yes to, it's what you say no to that is more important, because you kind of got to say no to 99 out of 100 things that come through your brain. Focusing on saying no to lots of things is really critical. I also just know from personal experience with Shoes of Prey that staying focused and not getting distracted, you've just got to do that. There were times through the 10 years of Shoes of Prey where we would get distracted by some new shiny object, and then the core business would suffer as a result of that. So I've kind of experienced that firsthand. And then, there's also a whole bunch of data that shows to be really good at one thing, you've got to spend 10,000 plus hours on that one thing, and you're not going to be able to do that if you're trying to do 5 things at once. So I just constantly keep trying to remind myself of all of that. And yeah, I think that helps me to rein it in.
Yeah. My other question on that was at the start of your previous answer there, saying that you're contrasting your passion behind Fable versus Shoes of Prey, that you want it to be something that you're so personally invested in, that everything that you believe in is behind this business. So what was that difference, and why do you believe that is important in running your own race and this journey that you're on?
So I was passionate about the business of Shoes of Prey, but I was never passionate about women's shoes and the core product. And, I tried to be, but I would never wake up on a Saturday morning and open up a fashion magazine and want to read about the fashion around women's shoes or the women's shoe product category. And I think that didn't help that market research issue that I talked about before, because I wasn't the customer. I wasn't constantly reading about the customer. I didn't deeply understand the psychology of the customer. And so I think that made it harder for me to identify the issues that ultimately meant that the business didn't succeed. I worked to get around that. I brought fashion experts into the business. We partnered with Nordstrom in the US, who are the largest retailer of women's fashion shoes in the US. They were on board with the market research being correct too. So, I tried to get around it in other ways, but I just personally wasn't deeply passionate about it. And so I think that just made some things harder. Whereas with Fable, I do literally go to bed listening to podcasts like yours. Love the hospitality space. I wake up on a Saturday morning and I'll be reading about what's going on in the meat alternative category in China and in Malaysia and in the US and in the UK. I just love this category, and I think that means that I get some more insights and knowledge that, particularly in a startup, that it's just helpful for identifying where there are opportunities, areas that we should avoid, and it's early days, but I think it gives us a higher probability of success as a startup. as well as just making life more enjoyable. Like, why go to work every day working on a product that you don't like? If money didn't matter, what I'm doing now is what I would want to do. I'd want to be working to help end industrial animal agriculture. Money does matter. I've got a young family. So what I'm doing now ticks both those boxes, which is just makes every day fun.
Yes, it's a way for you to do that using your skills and experience, which is obviously very exciting. Ultimately, everyone wants to leave on some level a legacy. That legacy can be planting a tree or having a child, building a business, making an incredible piece of art, expressing themselves. And, this is potentially a way of the various and vast many ways that you could leave a legacy. And so that resonates. That makes sense to me. Just paying attention to the time, I'm going to crack on to how you have modeled businesses that have come before yours to sort of stay away from competitors and mentors as words. I'm interested to know what you're modeling from successful businesses before you.
Yeah, it's a good question. Lots of different things. I think there's lots of people that I've learnt from along the way. Narrowing in my answer onto the meat alternative category, I think Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat, who are kind of the two big US players in this space, they've done an incredible job of helping to sort of grow this category, bring attention to this category. And I think they've done an amazing job of building what are now quite well-known and well-regarded food brands in a pretty quick or sort of rapidly short period of time. And so just looking at the ways that they've done that, their massive focus on product development and product quality has been a big part of it. And then the way that they've worked with both the food service space to have their brands sort of represent something and have a really good story behind their brand so that food service venues want to mention their brand on the menu. And then that then introduces the brand to consumers who then go out seeking venues that have these brands on the menu and then going out and seeking these products in retail. So I think that kind of go-to-market strategy of working with food service venues and building a food brand, they've executed that incredibly well. And we find that concept quite inspiring with Fable. Yeah, so I think those would be the key things.
What about outside of the alternative meat industry? Are there some businesses that have resonated with you? You've mentioned Steve Jobs just in passing there before. Maybe Apple's a business that you take some ideas from. Is there anywhere else?
Yeah, I think there's probably different things from different businesses. I mean, Apple's and Steve Jobs' focus on product was amazing. I worked at Google for 2.5 years earlier on in my career, and that was an amazing experience from like building a really strong and effective culture internally, and sort of their hiring approaches were really interesting to learn from. I find Uber a very fascinating business. They've done some things very poorly, but some areas where I think they've done well is just their relentless focus on growth and expansion. There's some interesting learnings out of that. Again, not they didn't do all of that well, but I think there's some really interesting learnings from that. I love the whole tech industry and the way that venture capital firms and fast growth tech firms think about business. I think there's a lot of really interesting learnings in all of that I apply, like just how to think about product market fit and not expanding your business, focusing the early years of your business on making sure that you've got really good product market fit, that your product is resonating with your target customer, continuously improving that product until you've just got customers banging down the door wanting your product, and only then sort of starting to really focus on fast growth and expansion. I think the hospitality industry, in just that experience that I mentioned of dining at the Fat Duck, the whole emotion around eating and drinking, I find fascinating and learn a lot from. It's such a deeply ingrained thing to eat and drink, and I think the hospitality industry, parts of it do an amazing job of bringing out the emotions and the memories. Some of my greatest memories are all kind of revolve around eating and spending time with other people. So I think there's a lot of good learnings in the hospitality space on that front too.
And on that, Heston is someone who 100% embodies the creative art form of food. And this has come up before, that it encompasses all 5 senses, being the only art form that does so. That's something incredibly powerful in his work as well. And he's pushed forward with a lot of that in more recent times, but there are certainly other chefs and creative minds who've done so. You just brought up Google there. Is there anything that you can share around the sorts of ideas that you mentioned that they hired really well? Is there something in that? You said that you learned some really interesting things. I just want to open that just before we move on to the next and last couple of questions in the show.
Yeah, I think the thing I learned was, and other people do this and have said this too, but just the not hiring too quickly, being really, really thorough with your hiring process. It can be so tempting when you're short of staff. When you're short of staff, you're crunched for time. It can be so tempting to just sort of do a quick interview process and grab somebody. But Google were very, very disciplined about, like when I got a job there, it was bordering on ridiculous, but I think I did like 15 interviews, flew from Brisbane down to Sydney for a day of testing, did some tests and stuff back at home. It was frustrating as hell as a candidate, but they were very, very thorough in their hiring process. So I got rejected once. Actually, part of the reason it was so long, I got rejected once, then applied for a different role. So it was probably twice as long for me. But like I could see when I was at Google and was interviewing other candidates that I'd interview someone and, it's early on in my career and I'd go, wow, this person's amazing, we should hire them. But then we'd sit down with 10 other people who'd interviewed that person and 2 or 3 people had asked some really insightful questions that I hadn't thought to ask. And yeah, they'd spotted things that, okay, that person's probably not going to be the right fit for the role. So I learned a lot about interviewing there, and then also just the power of reference checks and doing reference checks properly. You call someone to do a reference check on a potential recruit, that person's going to naturally want to say nice things. And even if they've had a bad experience with that person, they're going to just naturally want to say nice things because most people are like that. But developing the skill set to be able to ask like deep probing questions, to be able to draw out if they have had issues working with that person, drawing out what those are, I've found that really valuable. And since applying it, it's, I think, prevented me making a couple of mistaken hires, which is kind of good for me and good for the candidate who otherwise wouldn't have worked out.
I love asking deep probing questions. That's my thing on this show. Maybe I should be in recruitment. Yeah. I'm interested to know, Michael, what your biggest challenge is right now.
I think our biggest challenge is how do we get people to try our product? Like what we find is when people try the product, they love it. But how do we get to people to try it that first time? And particularly, again, late April with coronavirus going on, and food service sort of slowed right down. There's not as many opportunities to partner with restaurants and cafes to put Fable on the menu and have people try in venues. So, we're coming up, as I mentioned, with that date night hamper concept and some other concepts that we'll launch soon like it, coming up with creative ways to do that. And keen to chat to more restaurants about that. But what other sort of creative activations can we come up with to get people to try the product first time in this environment? That's where I'm spending a lot of my time, or what I'm spending a lot of my time thinking about at the moment.
What are you finding is an effective way that you've found so far? Because in that, if that's your biggest challenge, then that's the point of friction that you're experiencing. So there's nothing that's been like we're going to just run with that and do lots of that to make people try our product. Is there anything that you've found that has been more useful than others, or maybe might be more valuable for listeners, is if you've tried something that hasn't been valuable that you believe people should avoid if they're trying to do the same thing, get people to try their product?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll start with what has worked. So, meal kit companies like Marley Spoon have been amazing on that front. Customer gets the product, sees the brand on the packaging, and then gets a recipe to cook with it at home. So it's kind of like the ultimate way to full engagement with the product. You're not only eating with it, but you're also cooking with it yourself. And that's been amazing for us. Like we've had sort of 15,000 or so customers cook with the product at home now through Marley Spoon, and just had resoundingly good feedback. Early on, a couple of pieces of feedback that were really helpful for us to adapt the product, and we adjusted the texture of the product slightly out of that. And then since then, just really, really good positive feedback. And I think that's now we've got this big customer base who are going out and looking for the product. So meal kit companies have been super helpful. I was reflecting on that for the hospitality industry, because obviously that's a bit of a piece of competition, or sort of an area of competition for restaurants and venues. But one of the things I've found fascinating over this coronavirus period is how many restaurants and venues are kind of adapting to doing ready meals, and even a lot doing meal kits, so you do a bit of the preparation for yourself at home. So I think potentially coming out of this crisis, we might see more hospitality venues offering that as a product and service.
Yeah, I've seen like make your own pizza and all sorts of those kits being delivered, which is really interesting to see, because we've seen a generalized form of that movement even in other industries, like self-service checkouts, or it could be pushing the content creation onto the customer as well, like with Facebook and these other social platforms, because obviously there's a lot of costs that can be saved out of that process too. So the labor in doing that is a lot of the cost in the product, but but for a period of time, some of that cost can remain as part of the pack. You could even charge more for the delivery pack, even though it's not made, which is interesting. So I'm interested to see how that evolves as well.
And it's also another form of experience for the consumer too, because people do like being involved in the creation of a product, and in food in particular, people love cooking. And I think it'd be a really interesting way for cafes and restaurants to engage with their customers. So, you might come and have a dining experience, an amazing dining experience with the restaurant, but then, maybe you buy the curry paste from the restaurant and some of the other things, and you can create that sort of experience for yourself at home. It's just been fascinating watching cafes and restaurants experimenting. Obviously, you hope this period is over very soon, but one of the really fascinating and I think positive things out of it is the amount of kind of innovation and experimentation that it's driving as people look for ways to adapt. And I think it's going to, in so many different spaces, it's going to drive a whole bunch of changed behaviours going forward.
Yes, I think that's a great note to ask my last question for you, Michael. I'd love to know who you'd like to hear on the show.
I would love to hear Hayley Blyden from Australian Superfoods. She and her team have developed all these Australian native ingredient products, and a surprising number of restaurants are using, well, I guess not surprising, that her products are excellent. I cook with them at home, and a lot of different restaurants are using her products, and I find the whole native ingredient space fascinating. There's so many really interesting, unique flavors that we have in Australia, but they're just not really been part of our sort of culinary set. We've kind of adapted Asian and European ingredients, and we've done that quite well in Australia, but there's all these other native ingredients which we can use. And so Hayley's been building a business sort of developing those products, working with Indigenous communities to do that. And there's a whole bunch of really amazing flavors to cook with. So I'd love to hear from her.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for joining me on the program today, Michael.
Thank you, James. Great chatting to you.
This program is hosted by James Henderson, with technical production by Jake Olver. Voiceovers were by Angus Brennan and Shim Phelan. Thanks to our distribution team, led by Stephanie Holland, and a special thanks to you for tuning in every week. This program was produced by H Media. We'll see you soon.